The office was always quietest after 10. That kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but hollow, like the building itself had given up breathing. The fluorescent lights hummed in their tired sockets, and the vending machine in the corner clunked every so often, as if to remind me it still existed. Rows of cubicles stretched out in perfect order, but there was no life in them anymore. Just the ghosts of burned-out employees who had packed up early to escape another night of unpaid overtime. I stayed later than most, not because I loved the work, but because it had become my cage. And cages have a way of teaching you to mistake bars for safety. My name is Daniel Rourke. I'm 52 years old, and until a few months ago, I was Senior Procurement Manager at Halden Dynamics, a mid-size manufacturing firm that liked to pretend it played in the big leagues. I had been with the company for 24 years, long enough to see it change owners twice, rebrand 3 times, and shed more good men and women than I could count. They gave me plaques, hollow praise, and a parking spot close to the door, but never once a raise when I asked for one. Next quarter, they'd say. Budget constraints. But the constraints never seemed to reach the executive floor, where my boss sipped imported wine and took vacations she didn't bother hiding. For years, I swallowed it. I told myself it was stability, that loyalty meant something, that one day they'd look back and recognize the man who kept the whole damn supply chain from collapsing. But loyalty without respect is just slow suicide. And after watching my pension contributions stagnate while prices climbed, and colleagues half my age left for better-paying jobs, I finally decided I was done being the dutiful fool. The application I sent out wasn't desperate, it was precise. A position at a logistics firm across town, higher salary, better benefits, and above all, an environment that didn't grind its veterans into dust. I didn't think anyone at Halden would notice, but someone did. Or maybe she had been watching me all along, waiting for the moment to pounce. 2 days after the interview, I was summoned into her office. Evelyn Kerr, my boss, my executioner. She was seated behind a walnut desk that looked more expensive than my car, her manicured fingers drumming against a neat stack of papers. The blinds were half closed, slanting the room with stripes of shadow, and for a second, it felt like I was walking into a courtroom where the verdict was already written. She didn't ask me to sit. She didn't even greet me. She just tilted her head and said, "So, after everything I've given you, you go sniffing around elsewhere." Her voice was smooth, almost amused, but there was steel in it too. The kind you only hear when someone knows they have power and they're about to enjoy using it. I opened my mouth, thought about explaining that it wasn't betrayal, just survival. But then she leaned forward and cut me off. "You owe me loyalty, you fool." The words landed harder than if she had shouted them. She hissed them like a curse, as though 24 years of service meant nothing compared to the insult of me wanting a fair wage. Before I could answer, she slid the papers toward her, scrawled her signature, and looked me dead in the eye. "You're finished here. Effective immediately. And don't think you'll be touching that pension you've been so proud of. Consider it redirected." The smile she gave me then wasn't human. It was something colder, hungrier, like a predator savoring the last twitch of its prey. She enjoyed this. Firing me wasn't punishment enough. She had to strip me of everything I had built, every cent I had counted on, for the years ahead. I felt the air leave my lungs, but I didn't flinch. No anger, no pleading, no argument. I stood there, let her revel in her moment, and then I smiled. Not wide, not forced, just enough for her to see that her victory wasn't complete. She thought she had ended my story. She didn't realize she had just written the first line of another. I wished her good luck, turned without another word, and walked out of that office, the hum of the lights above sounding like a funeral dirge. She thought the silence meant she had won, but silence is just the sound of patience sharpening its blade. The first week after she fired me, I walked around like a man carrying invisible weights. Every errand, every small task, every polite conversation was painted with the shadow of that office and her smile when she cut me off. Evelyn Kerr didn't just take my job. She took 24 years of loyalty, crumpled it in her hands, and threw it in the trash. Most men would have raged, or begged, or drowned themselves in whiskey. I did none of those things. I went quiet. Silence has a way of stretching out, turning into something sharper than anger. And in that silence, I started remembering everything she had stolen long before she signed those papers. I built that department from nothing. When Halden Dynamics was just a struggling fabrication plant, I was the one who brokered supply deals in backrooms, drove trucks myself when drivers quit, and worked 70-hour weeks to keep production from collapsing. I missed anniversaries, funerals, birthdays. My daughter's piano recital, gone. My father's last week in hospice. I was stuck in a conference call about shipping delays. I told myself it was for stability, that someday the company would pay back the sacrifice. But every time review season came around, Evelyn's voice cut the same. Budget's tight. Be patient. The only thing that wasn't tight was her lifestyle. New cars, vacations in Tuscany, and end-of-year bonuses that dwarfed my salary. It would have been easier if she had just stolen my money. What she took was worse. My time, my belief, my loyalty. And then she demanded more of it, like a queen who expected her knights to kneel, even as she stripped them bare. I couldn't shake her last words. "You owe me loyalty, you fool." The sentence echoed in my head until the syllables turned into iron. But debt works both ways, and I intended to settle it. Quietly. I started digging. At first, it was just to know how she did it, how she could afford her house in the hills, and her endless parade of designer coats when our budgets were supposedly frozen. I still had my company laptop, still had access to certain shared drives no one had bothered to lock down. She assumed cutting me off meant erasing me. That was her first mistake. Expense reports opened like windows into rot. Conference trips billed twice. Client dinners that never happened. Transfers marked as vendor reconciliation that led to hollow shell accounts. And then the deeper vein, the retirement fund. The numbers didn't add up. Balances that should have been stable had been skimmed, diverted into accounts she controlled through proxies. She hadn't just cut me off. She'd been bleeding dozens of employees dry for years, siphoning their futures into her own pockets. Cold fury has a taste. Metallic, steady, nothing like rage. Rage burns too hot. Fury chills the bones and sharpens the mind. I didn't slam my desk or curse her name. I took notes. I built a map. Every lie, every theft, every signature she forged, I documented them all. I knew better than to confront her. A cornered animal lashes out, but a confident one grows careless. So I stayed invisible. I reached out to a handful of former colleagues, quiet conversations over coffee, carefully worded questions. Each one had their own story. Raises denied, pensions stalled, bonuses erased under the same excuse of budget constraints. They didn't know what I knew, but when I laid breadcrumbs, they started to see the trail, and a few of them were ready to help me follow it. My house turned into a war room. USB drives labeled and hidden, files encrypted under layers of decoy data, recordings copied onto multiple backups. I planted a recorder in the cafe, where she loved to boast about her power over staff, and she didn't disappoint. "They'll never leave," she told a friend one morning, laughing over her latte. "They're too afraid." And the ones who do? Well, they'll find out how expensive it is to walk away. I played that clip over and over, not because I needed proof. I already had enough to bury her, but because it reminded me of who she really was when the mask slipped. Patience is my weapon, sharper than any blade. She thought she'd ended my story. She thought I'd fade into obscurity, a discarded employee with no fight left. But every day, every file, every whispered conversation was another stone in the wall I was building around her. One night, alone in the dim glow of my monitor, I whispered to myself, the words tasting like steel on my tongue. She thought I was just a loyal worker. She never knew I'd been building a different set of books for her. The first crack in her armor showed on a Tuesday morning. Halden Dynamics received an unexpected audit request from a state compliance office, the kind of routine check that usually skimmed through numbers and moved on. But Evelyn Kerr didn't treat it like routine. She stormed through the halls with clipped heels, her face locked in that tight smile she wore when she was terrified, but refused to admit it. I watched from a distance. Invisible among the employees, she had forgotten I still knew. They whispered about her mood swings, about the late-night meetings behind closed doors, about how suddenly everyone was expected to re-sign confidentiality agreements. The Queen had begun demanding loyalty oaths from her subjects, and they were starting to see the crown for what it really was: paper and glue. Meanwhile, I worked quietly in the background. She thought I was gone, licking my wounds, maybe pulling shifts somewhere menial to make ends meet. She wasn't wrong about that part. I did pick up odd jobs, driving delivery trucks at night, working warehouse shifts by day. But she never realized how those jobs gave me access to shipping invoices, to vendor contracts, to backroom conversations where her name came up more often than she would have liked. Every dollar she misused, every falsified signature I uncovered, added another weight to the scales I was balancing against her. The whistleblower complaint hit 3 weeks later. It was anonymous, delivered through a secure channel, and written in a tone that made it sound like one of her mid-level managers had finally cracked under the strain. She called an emergency meeting that afternoon. I wasn't there, but I had a recording. A small microphone tucked in the conference room vent carried her voice to me, trembling beneath its polished veneer. "Someone here thinks they can betray me," she hissed. "Well, let me make this clear. You're either with me or you're gone. There is no middle ground." She had begun to unravel. The same employees who once cowered under her sharp tongue now saw the sweat on her brow. She shuffled numbers in a panic, called in favors from old board contacts, and rewrote reports late into the night. And with every frantic move she made, she exposed herself more. A tyrant is never more vulnerable than when they believe they're losing control. I remembered something an old mentor told me years ago, back when I was still learning the art of negotiation under pressure. "Don't confront a tyrant at their strongest," he had said. "Wait until they swing wildly." Then, cut deep at the time, I thought he was talking about business. Now I realized he had been talking about survival. Evelyn was swinging blindly, and all I had to do was step aside and let her momentum carry her toward the edge. Still, I held back. I had enough evidence to bury her twice over. But patience is not weakness, it's strategy. Every day I let her panic grow was another day she made herself an easier target. She berated staff until they quit, cut corners on contracts that left glaring trails, and sent late-night emails that contradicted her daytime lies. Her paranoia turned her into her own worst enemy, and I was content to sit in the shadows, recording every slip. The pressure inside Halden Dynamics reached a fever pitch by mid-month. Employees stopped trusting each other. Side conversations died the moment someone new entered the room, and Evelyn prowled the halls like a wolf circling a cage it couldn't escape. What she didn't know was that I had already planted the final piece, the one that would make sure the regulators didn't just glance her way. They would lock onto her, like predators scenting blood. It was an email chain, nothing more than a few back and forths between her and a fictitious vendor I had constructed carefully over weeks. On the surface, it looked legitimate. Scheduling notes, invoice confirmations, the kind of bland exchanges that no one questions. But buried in the thread was a single slip, subtle yet devastating, a falsified expense approval attached with her signature. It looked careless, like she had accidentally copied the wrong file, but it was damning enough to draw investigators directly into the maze of accounts she had built. When I hit send, forwarding that chain through a channel that made it appear like a clerical mistake from inside her own team, I knew the trap was set. Regulators wouldn't see it as a whistleblower's claim or a disgruntled employee's vendetta. They would see it as Evelyn Kerr slipping, exposing herself through arrogance and carelessness. And as I watched the confirmation message blink across my screen, I leaned back, steady, silent, patient. She thought she was tightening her grip on the company. She didn't know I was tightening the noose around her neck. The first official inquiry landed like a thunderclap. A letter from federal auditors, stamped and signed, demanding full disclosure of Halden Dynamics expense records. Evelyn Kerr tried to spin it as a routine compliance check, but the lie didn't last long. Within days, investigators were in the building, combing through files, asking questions she couldn't answer cleanly. I didn't have to be there to know the effect. Word spread fast, faster than any memo she could craft. The Queen's composure was cracking, and the court she ruled with fear began to whisper in the shadows. She tried to plug the holes by force. Entire folders disappeared overnight from the shared drives. Whole binders were shredded in the locked copy room. She even ordered staff to wipe laptops, claiming they were phased-out equipment, slated for replacement. But it was already too late. Every file she destroyed had already been copied, cataloged, and stored in places she couldn't touch. I had anticipated each desperate move before she even made it. She was running a race against an enemy she didn't realize had already crossed the finish line. Her rage turned inward toward the people who once trembled under her command. She screamed at accountants, accused assistants of betrayal, even fired 2 managers in a single morning for failing to protect confidential data. But fear loses its bite when the predator is bleeding. Subordinates began documenting her tirades, forwarding suspicious requests, and some quietly reached out to the auditors themselves. The empire she built on intimidation was rotting from the inside, every brick loosening in the walls she thought were impenetrable. I stayed silent. To her, I was gone, irrelevant, a casualty she had dismissed months ago. That invisibility was my weapon. From the outside, I watched her scramble, her rhythm faltering with every headline that trickled out into the local press. Halden Dynamics faces questions over misused funds. Executives silent on pension irregularities. Reporters circled like vultures. And shareholders demanded meetings she couldn't postpone forever. The higher the pressure mounted, the deeper she sank into paranoia. Betrayal never announces itself with a scream. It arrives with silence, the silence of employees who stop meeting your eyes, The silence of board members who no longer return your calls. The silence of allies who quietly calculate whether standing by you is worth the cost. I knew that silence well. I had lived it. Now I watched her drown in it. The woman who once barked orders with absolute confidence was now pacing hallways in the middle of the night, clutching files like lifelines, muttering to herself about loyalty. Each step she took toward concealment only painted her guilt in brighter colors. She tried moving money between accounts, frantic transfers that left trails regulators could follow in minutes. She signed contradictory statements, leaving her own name scrawled on both sides of a lie. She reached out to old contacts in government, begging for favors, but even they backed away. No one wants to be chained to a sinking ship. The tension rose by the hour. I imagined her in that office of polished walnut and glass, the same desk where she once smirked at me and told me I was finished. Now the surface would be cluttered with shredded paper, sticky notes, and empty coffee cups, her empire shrinking to the size of a cage. She was fighting ghosts, and the cruelest part was that she didn't even realize whose hand had started the haunting. Still, I withheld the final strike. A confrontation now would rob me of the satisfaction of watching her destroy herself piece by piece. I wanted her to feel the weight of every silence, every whisper, every eye turned against her. I wanted her to realize the loyalty she demanded had curdled into contempt long before the first subpoena landed. That night, as I reviewed the last of my files, I saw the headlines begin to shift. National outlets picked up the story. Commentators speculated about fraud, embezzlement, maybe even criminal charges. Evelyn, for all her scheming, had become a caricature, a greedy executive unraveling under the spotlight. She must have thought she could still claw her way out, that one more forged report or shredded file would save her. I leaned back in my chair, calm, patient, watching her empire rot from the inside out. She thought she had one last escape, a final cover-up that might erase the trail. She was wrong. "Tomorrow," I whispered. "Tomorrow, it all burns." The morning it all came down was colder than usual, the kind of morning where the sky itself looked brittle. I drove past Halden Dynamics just as the first black SUVs rolled in, their tinted windows reflecting nothing, their engines humming with quiet authority. Federal auditors and agents in plain suits poured out in a line, clipboards and warrants in hand, while local reporters scrambled to set up cameras across the street. The raid wasn't a surprise. I had prepared every detail, sent every document through channels that left no doubt. I knew exactly when they would strike. Evelyn Kerr did not. Inside those walls, panic was immediate. Employees huddled in corners while agents seized computers, copied hard drives, and demanded records Evelyn had tried to erase. Files she thought were gone appeared again in the hands of investigators, perfectly intact, every line of fraud underlined and tagged. She fought at first, denied, deflected, blamed subordinates. But each rebuttal was met with another stack of evidence, each more damning than the last. The foundation she built her empire on wasn't cracking anymore. It was gone, swallowed whole. I watched from the sidewalk as she was forced into the lobby by two agents, her once perfect hair tangled, her face pale with sweat. She barked at them, waved her hands, tried to command the room like she always had. "This is a mistake. You don't know who I am. You don't know what I've given this company." The agents didn't answer. They just kept walking, unflinching, pulling her closer to the waiting cuffs. The headlines came within the hour. Halden Dynamics executive accused of fraud and embezzlement. Retirement funds stolen in corporate scheme. Former allies, board members, and mid-level managers all began testifying. Some offered statements to save themselves, others because they had finally found their courage. Her name, once spoken with a mix of fear and respect, now carried only disgust. It spread like fire, consuming every corner of her carefully crafted reputation. Investors bailed. Shareholders demanded her removal. Accounts she controlled were frozen before she could move another cent. She still tried to claw her way out, even as the cuffs closed around her wrists. "You owe me loyalty," she shouted at her staff gathered in the lobby. Her voice cracked with desperation, but no one moved to defend her. No one even looked at her. Loyalty had died long before this moment, smothered under years of arrogance and theft. She was alone now, stripped of the throne she thought she'd hold forever. I stood across the street, hands in my pockets, letting the chaos wash over me. For months, I had been invisible, a ghost moving between shadows, collecting, building, preparing. And now, every scrap of evidence I had delivered was doing exactly what it was meant to, cutting away every escape, every excuse, every last shred of power she had left. She had thought silence was submission. She never realized silence was the sound of a trap being set. As they pulled her through the front doors, her eyes swept the crowd, searching for someone, anyone, to validate her, to tell her she still mattered. No one did. She screamed again about loyalty, about betrayal, about how she had given everything. But the world had already moved on. Her pension, gone. Her career, vaporized. Her reputation, shredded into 1,000 pieces scattered across the headlines. I let myself smile, just a small cold curve of the lips. She wanted loyalty, I whispered. What she got was justice. The crowd thinned as agents loaded her into the back of a car, and the cameras followed the convoy away. I turned and walked, not toward celebration, not toward vengeance fulfilled, but toward the quiet that always follows when the storm has passed. Betrayal, I've learned, isn't confined to marriages or battlefields. It festers in boardrooms, break rooms, anywhere power corrupts trust. It thrives in silence until the silence is broken, and then it consumes everything in reach. Revenge, though, is never about anger. Anger burns fast and leaves nothing but ashes. No, revenge is about balance, about setting the scale right when someone tips it too far. This was my story. Tomorrow, there will be another. Because betrayal never sleeps, and silence is always waiting.